We have a new leader, the next Prime Minister of Canada, le prochain Premier Ministre du Canada, the Honourable Pierre Poilievre and Anna Poilievre.
Hello, and thanks for listening to Speech from the Throne, episode 25. It's Jacob Kenny here, and very soon you'll be hearing the voice of co-host Lee McPherson as well. This Saturday, September 10th, we participated in our very first live stream on Twitter Spaces, reacting to the results of the 2022 Conservative Party of Canada leadership election. Pierre Poilievre won that race with 68% of points available on the first round of the ballot, winning the most votes in almost every single riding of the country. An absolutely stunning, monumentally sized victory. Liam and I discussed the results, the race, the faux drama of Jean Charest's pathetic attempt at relevancy, and most importantly, how Trudeau can position himself against Poilievre in the House and in the next general election. It was an excellent discussion where we were joined for a few minutes at the beginning by independent journalist Chris Curtis of the Rover for his analysis. We all immensely enjoyed the pressure of performing for a live audience and will likely try streaming again with more options for audience participation and special guests. And now, without further ado, here is our live coverage of the CPC leadership results.
Hello, welcome. I see there's a listener that's joined us. It's great of you to tune in. We're just actually talking about the Conservative leadership race, the federal Conservative leadership race. We are waiting for the results to roll in here. Myself and my friend Jacob Kenny, we have a podcast called Speech from the Throne. And today we thought we'd do a little Twitter space just to kind of break down the race as the results roll in. Right now, there's a number of Conservative MPs doing some virtual speeches. So we're just kind of killing time here, and I'm just filling airtime while Jacob shares the link with our followers. And I was just saying that the Conservative grassroots as in the grassroots card-carrying members, has become very, very different than what the rest of Canada looks like. And that's become an issue electorally for them, where they don't want to accept carbon pricing. They don't want to accept marching in pride parades. They don't want to accept large social programs. So the gap between these two cohorts, Canadians and the Conservative grassroots, is widening, which makes it very challenging for anybody leading the Conservative Party to sort of straddle that line. Aaron O'Toole tried to and failed. Andrew Scheer didn't really try, and he was beat up because he didn't really try. So whoever's coming in this time, whether it's Pierre Poilievre, whether it's Jean Charest by some miracle, is going to have a challenge. And I mean, they have Trudeau's unpopularity on their side, but it becomes extremely difficult when, even against an unpopular leader, when you won't support any form of action on the environment, when you barely support LGBTQ people, it becomes very distasteful to a large segment of the population. So there'll be a real challenge here. Pierre Poilievre, if he wins, is going to focus a lot on cost of living, I think, and talk a lot about the economy, because Trudeau's been invisible on that. Any thoughts on that, Jacob? Are you still sharing the link?
No, I'm just watching. It looks like Candice Bergen here is going to announce the first round. I'm not totally sure, or maybe it's just another speech. But in the meantime, no, I think it's very interesting what you just said. And as I was preparing for this live stream, I was dissecting the results from the last election, 2021, looking at Western Canada in particular, the base of the Conservative movement, and even in Western Canada, what I did was I ran sort of a hypothetical turnout model where there had been 100% turnout in every riding, because there are lots of ridings in Alberta and Saskatchewan where Liberals and NDP don't even bother turning out because the winner is victorious. If every single riding had 100% turnout, the left and right wing voters in even Western Canada would have essentially equated themselves. There would have been about 3.2 million NDP and Liberal combined voters. There would have been 3.4 million combined Conservative and PPC voters. And so even in the very conservative part of the country, it's still that electoral system, the first past the post system, that's giving the Conservatives their power. They don't have an overwhelming popular advantage. And so when you're talking about a conservative party that is very different from the rest of the country, I think that's totally true. But that doesn't mean that they're necessarily guaranteed to lose. I think the problem is that
No.
they can play the system well enough that they can still win. I mean, like, so they only have a little bit more than 50% of the vote in Western Canada, but they have 3/4 of the seats, simply because they can overwhelm any of their opponents. And that's essentially what they want to replicate in the rest of the country. Now, the Liberals are well organized in the eastern part of the country, in central Canada and in eastern Canada. But if that organization falls apart, if they no longer can rally the left behind Justin Trudeau, it's not as difficult for Pierre Poilievre to win as it might currently seem.
No, and yeah, you have to remember that politics in Canada is so leader driven, right? It's so leader driven, and I think in large part the voting coalitions that wind up forming over the course of a prime minister's incumbency are very much based on that prime minister, on who votes for that prime minister, and the party as it appears under that prime minister. And I wouldn't be surprised if so Trudeau's very, very popular out east. He's probably still the most liked out here than perhaps anywhere else in the country, including Ontario, though he still pulls enough seats in Ontario to help him win. That could be challenged as his popularity drags down. And if Pierre Poilievre can come in and stay away from the Bitcoin talk and stay away from some of this cultural war stuff, I think he'll have a lot easier time getting people behind him. If he goes into the race and talks about the cost of living like he's doing now, but then makes that his focus, I think he'll have a lot better shot. If he's talking to people in a language they can understand, which he has been doing, he for all his smarminess in question period, for how partisan he is, how much he irks people who aren't conservative, he's very good at talking to regular people in a way that they can understand. He doesn't sound like a walking, talking speaking note. And that's incredibly effective, particularly when you're talking about housing. Even though he's not going to be able to force municipalities to play ball at all, he has no authority over that whatsoever. He's talking about it. The Liberals right now are not talking about it, and that presents a serious challenge.
No, that's completely true. And I do think that, because Pierre Poilievre has positioned himself as this outsider, as the person who is critiquing the system, it does afford him some message avenues that are not available to the prime minister, particularly a prime minister like Justin Trudeau, who, even though he might be on the left, and you could say that sometimes the left stands for a progressive side, the side that's trying to move our politics, to evolve our politics. And Justin Trudeau, simply because he owes a lot of his position to being a son of the prime minister, he owes so much of his privilege and power to this system. He has to defend it in some certain way. He cannot ever apologize for it fully. He can never fully move away from an endorsement of that thing that gives him his own personal prestige and power. And so, in a way, he has to act completely differently than Pierre Poilievre. Pierre Poilievre doesn't have to be perfect all of the time. He can admit to faults, for example. Things that would sink Justin Trudeau, such as shaking the hands of a person that's a white supremacist and then accused of various weapons crimes, like Pierre Poilievre has done. Pierre Poilievre can say, "Well, I shake dozens of, I shake so many hands, I can't possibly vet everyone." That's an admission of guilt that would never pass Justin Trudeau's lips. He would probably obfuscate or fail to admit at all that he had any sort of moral failing. Whereas Pierre Poilievre can more easily say, "Well, I have a moral failing, but the system that I'm fighting against is far worse, and so you have to choose me over the alternatives." He can brush everything away because he admits that there's something wrong with the status quo. And he admits that the status quo is so wrong that even him, a very unperfect vehicle, a vehicle with horrible problems, in fact, with flaws that are immediately apparent, both on an aesthetic issue and an immoral issue, because he is willing to point out the horrible circumstances that many people live in and offer them a solution. He's providing a rhetorical strategy where people can forgive his flaws. But Justin Trudeau, who has to go out every day and say the system is perfect, the system produced this brilliant leader, aka me, with no problems whatsoever. He cannot ever really admit to the problems that we are facing, because if he did talk about this world where people are being faced with unjust consequences, where people are being unjustly deprived, you'd have to ask the ancillary question of, well, does Justin Trudeau also deserve what he has in his life as well? His political positioning requires him to be perfect, whereas Pierre Poilievre's political positioning does not, and it's an ultimate flaw that could end up sinking him, I think.
Well, I think you're onto something there, and he's had Justin Trudeau has had repeated ethical issues throughout his term. I see, just want to acknowledge people in the audience here for a minute. We've got Bethany Drader. We've got Chris Curtis from the Rover here. Nice to see you. We've got tweets from Evan. It's great to see everybody here so far. If you're just joining us, we're just breaking down kind of the context surrounding the federal conservative leadership race. I was just talking about how Justin Trudeau, he's got the long tooth of incumbency. He's had repeated ethical hiccups. He's fled the field on inflation, allowing a huge opening for Pierre Poilievre if he does win. If by some miracle Jean Charest wins, this is going to look completely different. I really can't see how he's going to pull it off. We've seen stranger things before, but his path to victory must be pretty thin. I don't know what you think, Jacob.
I don't know why we would pretend that there's any drama in this evening. That's very clearly not what was happening from the very beginning. Stephen Harper did not want Jean Charest to take over, and it seems that he's definitely, or him and people that think like him definitely are still very much in control of the party. And they were not going to let a progressive conservative win. But more importantly, Jean Charest stands for things that not just conservatives don't want, but I don't think the population at large wants. When Jean Charest talks, he speaks as though the neoliberal policies he represents are ends in and of themselves, that like low taxes for businesses, that free trade, are inherently good. He grew up in an environment where capitalism, where the ultimate fight of the day was capitalism versus communism. He never had to he never had to pivot between the two. He never had to.
That's right.
Explain. Oh, we have is Chris, are you talking, Chris?
No, that was me.
oh, sorry.
Chris, if anybody wants to jump in. By the way, this is supposed to be like sort of collaborative. If anybody wants to jump in with a point, they can request to speak. They're more than welcome to share their point of view. We would absolutely love that if anybody wants to. No pressure. If you want to listen, that's cool too. But good to see everybody here. I know you're all politicos.
In the context of Charest's youth, the goal of neoliberal politicians was not to justify neoliberalism; it was to attack socialism, and the fact that they were the only alternative meant that they won by default. Now there is another conservative alternative, and I think they're realizing, he doesn't have any real justifications for why he wants to impose a neoliberal policy. All he can say is, I'm not Justin Trudeau. He cannot say, this is why I'm better than Pierre Poilievre, and that's the problem.
Well, you're bang on, and he's had a really interesting career because, as you said, he came from a different era where, as you were saying, is capitalism versus communism. He was relatively young when he started his career in the 80s. He was strictly progressive conservative until the Quebec Liberals begged him to lead the party. He managed to become premier of Quebec, but this could be twice now that he's sitting at a leadership convention floor in second. And I see Chris is on here too. Hey, Chris.
Yeah, let's get you, Chris.
Well, first I just want to say it's awesome that you guys have this space. I hadn't spoken to you guys in a while. I just wanted to kind of pop in and say hi. And then I realized what was happening, and what a big day today is. The coronation, in keeping with this week's theme. Queen's dead. I was really that point you just made about the sort of that the binary, right? Like communism, capitalism, like that being the era of politics for Jean Charest. Like, yeah, that was how he stayed in power. Like he in Quebec, he was not a separatist, right? And that kind of defined his reign to outsiders, but like to people who had to live under a state governed by Jean Charest, like those austerity measures were brutal. And I mean, the last 2-3 years of his was it 9 years in power? Yeah, 9 years in power. The last 2 years, it was constant chaos in the street. And, cops fighting with student protesters. The city was shut down. The Liberal Party had to basically cancel a huge meeting because there was like a once in a lifetime riot outside in Victoriaville. Anyhow, I'm arriving at the end of my point, and I'll bid you both farewell and go back to listening. But what really when I think of Charest, I think of those years. I think of that chaos, and I think to a degree, right? That's the sort of neoliberalism that I see when I see Charest, and increasingly, when we look to sort of where the Liberals are headed in the future, probably a lot of belt tightening. That's what I anticipate. So anyhow, all of which is to say thanks for having this, guys, and thanks. That was a great point about Charest.
Oh, thanks for joining us, Chris. That was great.
Thanks for jumping in. And you know what? It's so true. I think especially like the past, since he's joined this leadership race, Charest has been kind of trying to maybe launder his reputation a little bit, but people don't forget, like you said, the student protests, the way he cracked down on students in a, by the way, completely unlawful way. And then there's a whole bunch of people within the Tories who never liked him.
I forgot how he had basically introduced like these super draconian pro-police laws that were like, I mean, would have been laughed out of a courtroom, and actually some version of it was laughed out of a courtroom. Anyhow, that's an excellent point. The brutality of the repression, like the closest I've ever come to dying was like once or twice during those riots. Like you see a rubber bullet whiz by your head, or you almost get trampled. Like you're terrified of being. Anyways, those are my memories of Jean Charest.
I believe it, and honestly, like so I think he's not had to launder his reputation as much in the rest of Canada because they're blind to those issues. That's I remember seeing the headlines. I would have been in grade 11, I think, when that was going on. So I remember seeing the reports on the morning news, like student protests, and I'm like, what? Like this is a student protest? Like this is crazy, And then like I hear about like the rubber bullets and the draconian law that he was trying to pass, and it's like, oh my goodness. And so, Quebec doesn't forget that. I mean, he definitely still has a strong base of old Quebec Liberals that still like him, but outside of that, I don't think I think to this day, he's still a particularly unpopular person. I think people like my father, who grew up, he destroyed
the Liberal Party in Quebec. He'll never recover.
Oh my God, they have no, and Chris, you've been saying a lot in your coverage, they have no direction right now. And in large part, that's due to the fact that they can't figure out who they are without him and Couillard. So it's a huge issue right now for the Quebec Liberals, for Charest. I think people like my father remember Charest a little bit more fondly because they remember him as a Mulroney cabinet minister. They didn't pay as much attention to what he did in Quebec because they didn't, when you don't live in a place, sometimes sadly, you don't pay as much attention unless you make the effort to. But it's going to be really interesting to see if he somehow pulls it off. I highly doubt it because Poilievre sold over 300,000 memberships. He's raised the most money by far. He's got wicked social media engagement. He's got the master of dark arts, Jenny Byrne, on his side. I just don't really know how anybody else could win. What do you think, Jacob?
No, I completely
Or
agree
Chris,
with you.
anybody.
I did find it very interesting, and I should say more annoying, the way that the conservative conversation was framed when talking about social conservative voters in particular, that they were always called, in the media coverage I listened to, as values voters. And I think the fundamental idea was that in that framing, the idea is that only social conservatives have values, and that neoliberal voters or red Tories, they care about balancing the budget, or they care about lower taxes. They don't have quote unquote values. They have like intellectual beliefs, and that's absolutely ridiculous. Every voter is a values voter, but Jean Charest was unable to recognize this fact, and he was unable to recognize this fact and succeed in Quebec politics for a long time. But he cannot recognize this reality and succeed in federal politics at this moment, and that's something that Pierre Poilievre obviously does see. And Jean Charest's whole campaign was a technocratic campaign. He's running to be the prime minister of Italy, essentially. He's running to be a guy who's picked from a list of resumes and says, "Oh, I have the experience and I have the competence and I can be this great manager." But that's not the discussion that conservative voters were having. That's not the discussion that Conservative Party members were interested in entering. They're having discussion about culture. They're having a discussion about the way that our society is evolving, the way that society is escaping their ability to control it and shape it, and how they want to, once again, have that control again. And that's not something that Jean Charest was willing to enter into. He had nothing to say in these points, and that's why he can't possibly win it at this stage in the game. He was talking to people, he was talking to people who, if this was like a one-party state, or if this was if this was like the Alberta of my childhood, where it was a bunch of oil executives that were choosing who would be the leader, those arguments make great points. When you're talking to real human beings who have actual beliefs, who have actual values, talking about the GDP or talking about why you have more experience than the other guys, it's silly. That's not where people are. That's not where their emotions are. Obviously, conservative voters feel like they've lost something in modernity. They've lost something in the way that our society has evolved. Pierre Poilievre is willing to address those, even if he's willing to address them in the most pandering and ridiculous ways. Jean Charest wasn't, and Jean Charest couldn't, and that's why we're going to see him lose.
Yeah, I think you pretty much you summed her up right there. And I think I've said before, I've said on our podcast and elsewhere that he's very much yesterday's man. He was trying to lean on, I think, I was a unifier in the referendum and I have experience, like you were saying. And I think exactly, it doesn't meet the moment. And whether we like it or not, Pierre is meeting the moment. And it's going to become incredibly dangerous, I think, for the left wing if they can't find a way to respond to it.
This is like what this reminds me of is like Charest. I would almost argue like is he like a plant from Poilievre's camp? Because it's like that, like when Muhammad Ali was coming up, they legitimized Muhammad Ali by having him, of course, back then he was Cassius Clay. They dragged out Archie Moore because Archie Moore had been a world champion, but at this point Archie Moore was an old man. And Muhammad Ali just beats the hell out of him, and that's kind of what's happening here, right? Is he's just like, Poilievre gets to redefine himself right now as a winner, and people like a winner. People will adjust the outer edges of their belief system to be a winner, and of course, what happens when you do that is that like the outer edges, get wider and wider, and eventually you just change to win. And I feel like this is Canada's big populism moment. People are there's something infectious about Poilievre. I honestly, I find him to be a really despicable person and politician. And, I've had my beef with him, but he's a good he's an excellent politician, and I can't say that about anyone else in Canada right now.
Yeah. He reminds me a lot. In the early 2010s, there was this political movement that seems to have mostly fizzled out in Italy, but in Italy it's called the Five Star Movement, and it was led by a former comedian. And even though he said things that were completely ridiculous and completely stupid, the central argument was, our system is so fricked up. Even me, this dummy, and this obvious dummy, can succeed in this system. And so, in fact, the success of the movement was proof that the movement was correct in its central thesis. And I do think that Pierre Poilievre has a little bit of this quality, where when you look at him at first glance, he's just like this whiny femboy standing up there trying to seem tougher than he possibly could be. He's never had a real job. He doesn't seem to have any real touch with common people. It's all feigned. It's obviously an act. And anyone should be able to see through this. But I think the fact that it is so easy to see through this is maybe a little bit of the point. It invites people to live in that fantasy land of, if I can live in a world where someone like Pierre Poilievre can be prime minister, then I too can succeed in my wildest imaginations as well. It's sort of showing that anybody can achieve their goals, and it's also showing that if we live in a system where me, who talks like this, who makes all of these constant stupid mistakes, can still succeed, it does show that the system is ripe for destruction, that the system can be easily changed, which is what he's trying to tell us. And
it's a perfect argument, because whenever were to ever form a government, and were he to ever enact some of these policies, and by the way, he would never go nearly as radical as he says he would, because ultimately, when you get the keys to the car in this country like this, it's such a big machine, you can't just turn it around. But let's say he does, and he enacts his policies, and if and when they fail, he could just say, well, the system was rigged against me, we need to destroy more of the system. Like it does have a shelf life,
exactly.
And it does the act eventually gets old, but it works at first, and there is a sincerity, even though he's full of shit. There is weirdly a sincerity in a lot of what he's doing and saying, even though it might be evil at its core. I shouldn't say evil; it's a bad word, but even though a lot of what he's saying is bullshit, and even though you find him kind of a little bit repugnant, it appears it's a lot less rehearsed than the prime minister, and it's speaking to the right people, people with nothing, and that's a form of conservatism we haven't really seen in Canada, that nakedly appeals to that populist instinct, but directs it towards not only the sort of liberal elite, but the elite everywhere. And anyways, I'm interested in Poilievre in a way I haven't been interested in a conservative in a long time.
He's definitely a little bit of an enigma in that sense. I mean, that's definitely true. And as you said, he's devastatingly good at what he does, whether we like it or not. I listen a lot to a podcast called Cursive Politics. I'm not sure if anybody else listens to it. It's got David Hurley and Scott Reed. They're ex-Liberal staffers. And Scott Reed made a really good point. He said that, I always tell people to watch Poilievre's videos, and they always give me a lot of crap, and they're like, that's ridiculous. He's ridiculous. Why in the world would we watch his videos, And he says, listen, you need to watch his videos because he's a classic retail politician in the classic sense. He's so good at what he does. The Pearson video, right? There he is. He's walking the line of people waiting and waiting and waiting, and he's talking in a way that you can understand. He's not talking in a way that was written by a 27-year-old PMO staffer. He's talking in a human way, explaining a human problem. Same with the passport office. Same with that kid that was crawling into his window because he was late for an exam and had to get something. And then he started, for some reason, Pierre Poilievre started barking at him about like housing policy, but it still worked really well. And that's the thing, is he just seems to have a natural knack for it. And I think it's possible that even some of that was improvised, maybe not. But regardless, he's very good. And I mean, I do think some of the benefit to Poilievre here is that the field is much less crowded than compared to 2020 and compared to 2017. I think that, you've got Pierre Poilievre, who's speaking to the concerns of the moment. You've got Jean Charest, who's trying to be the experienced man, which is like, you're in the wrong decade, dude. You've got Scott Aitchison, who's like, won't someone please think of the children? Please stop screaming at each other. You've got Leslyn Lewis, who's just Leslyn Lewis. And then you've got Roman Baber, who's only claim to fame is that he was kicked out of Doug Ford's caucus for being too conservative. So it's like Jean Charest, Pierre Poilievre, and a bunch of nobodies, honestly. Maybe with the exception of Leslyn Lewis, because she does have a small sort of fervent group of supporters, but I don't think it'll be near enough to pull through, and I don't think it's going to be near enough to what we saw in 2020 for her.
So it's interesting when you list all those members of the leadership contest there, because the most disturbing fact about that is when you put them head to head, Pierre Poilievre doesn't end up necessarily on the right wing of those contenders. He's actually somewhere in the middle of his party,
which is a problem in and of itself, right?
Yeah, you could put Lewis and Baber more to the right of him, and you could say that Roman Aitchison is stylistically different than Poilievre, but actually
Roman Aitchison.
Sorry, oh my God.
No, I know. It's okay.
That these, he comes off seeming like a centrist if all you're getting is conservative talking points in conservative media. And, we're looking at Pierre Poilievre from the mainstream media or from our own liberal political biases. But there's a lot of the country that is no longer connected to those mainstream sources. There's a lot of people that, I have lots of relatives in Alberta and Saskatchewan that if anything is published by CBC, they'll immediately believe the opposite, regardless of the headline. There's a lot of people who are consuming their media strictly from Facebook, strictly from Rebel News, strictly from off mainstream sources. And if you're getting it from those angles, Pierre Poilievre doesn't look like an extremist. He looks like he's the compromiser. He's the rational middle choice. And I think that's the type of person that can very easily win an election. So for us, that we get our news in fairly conventional ways still, he seems absolutely unconscionable for a population that's accepting media from various different sources that no longer has a unified view of who is radical and who is moderate. It becomes much easier to imagine a world where he could be accepted. There could be a population, maybe even a very large portion of the population, that forever thinks of him as a radical, that forever thinks that he is unconscionable. But so long as you have a strategically positioned portion of the population that's distributed in just the right amounts and the right ridings, that gets their media sources from a very particular slice of the political spectrum, he could end up being in power. That's all you really need in this country. And it's, as I said, as I began this broadcast, that's really a product of a horrible, antiquated system of voting that we have forced upon ourselves for no reason. That was promised to have been changed. Yeah.
There is a reason. I know there's a reason, but just to articulate it for everybody listening here, the reason that we're stuck with this system is because the party that wants to change it gets in, wins huge, and then realizes they actually like it.
Yeah, of course.
So
yeah.
it just perpetuates the fact that nothing changes until somebody with gumption, which is rare these days, actually just legislates it already. I think you made a great point there about Pierre Poilievre looking like the sane moderate, which is in and of itself extremely disturbing. But that's where the grassroots is at today. that's where the grassroots of that party is at today. And modern politics is just chopping up data pies, right? It's like, what data pie are we baking today? Oh, we're going to get 5% in Ontario. We're going to get this in Quebec. And we're going to get this. I mean, the numbers are totally wrong, but you get what I'm saying. You know, you're literally slicing provinces into data tranches to see how many tranches you can assemble enough to get your guy over the finish line. And Poilievre is assembling a very different coalition from Trudeau, but it's incorrect to say that there won't be some of the same people. You know, so we have to remember that some of the same people vote for Doug Ford and Justin Trudeau, which seems really, seems bizarre, but it does happen. And also I want to give a shout out to Aaron Derfell. He's listening here. He's a great reporter from Quebec. He did a great job holding François Legault to account for all of his mistakes. And I just wanted to say hello and what an honor to have you here, sir. And I'll pass it to Jacob.
No, I just wanted to point out to everyone that's listening, we just got the warning from the event organizers at CPC headquarters that they're going to be delivering results in 10 to 15 minutes. Apparently, they've just received the first round results and are going to be releasing them very soon. They just need to be calculated, they say, need to be tabulated.
If anybody wants to tune in on YouTube, the Conservative Party has an official feed. That's what we're watching. That's the context.
Well, I'm actually watching the CBC coverage thereof, but I do flip between them both. I like to get the raw, unedited version from the Tories' mouth, and then I like to get it from the CBC as well. It's an interesting little contrast, but
yeah, yes. and a little bit of a different. You have zero editorializing, and then you have maybe a little bit of editorializing, and they always do great coverage of these leadership races. So I mean, you're tune into CBC if you like, tune into wherever, but I definitely encouraging you to tune in, period, because it definitely enhances your experience, because you get both our voices blathering on, and you get the voices of people on stage blathering on. So it's a double whammy. But anywho, I mean, how close do we think this thing is going to be? Probably not much. I mean, I guess first round is the first round. It could go to the second round, but does it go beyond the second round?
I mean, it seems to be the consensus that I'm hearing from at least the insiders that I listen to is that it's going to be like in the upper 60s for Pierre Poilievre out of the gate.
You think so?
Yeah.
Wow, that would be a historic route.
I mean, I think there's no reason for anybody to be voting at this point, having known what the outcome is. Now, I don't know. The only possibility I can imagine is that Leslyn Lewis overperforms again, like last time. Like, I just don't see how Jean Charest could possibly do it. Jean Charest is connected into the same media ecosphere as you and every other journalist. So if there was a secret underground Jean Charest operation, we would have heard it already. Leslyn Lewis is by being so connected to the conspiracy bandwagon, she is de facto speaking to channels that we do not have access to. So it's quite possible that those channels could be much more active than we ever could anticipate. And maybe there's a secret SoCon uprising or anti-vaxxers that have joined her at the last minute. I doubt it. That's the only, to me, that's the only question.
Well, you know what changed things for me?
What do you think? What do you think?
Like, I mean, I don't think the outcome is in doubt. I mean, I think Pierre Poilievre still wins. But what changed my perception a little bit is just, I mean, like, it's normal for leadership races for not all of the members to actually vote in the leadership race. So I think there were 680 some thousand memberships that they sold, and there's only about just over 4. I'd have to get the exact number in front of me, but over 4 that voted, 400,000. And it's going to be interesting to see which how the tranches of who voted for who changes based on that. And I mean, I do think Poilievre's voters are very motivated, but you also have a lot of Poilievre supporters who, and I say, a lot of them as in like the more conspiracy minded folks who maybe don't want to send any of their information to Deloitte or something. And maybe they have like a weird idea about that. So I don't know if that would affect things enough to change the outcome, but it's going to be interesting to see how many of his voters were motivated, how many were maybe thrown off by the process or fell off the wagon somehow. It's going to be interesting as well to see who else gets their vote out. Does Leslyn Lewis manage to replicate some sort of success? Is there a dark horse that we haven't even talked about? It's going to be really interesting, but I don't think it's going to be as interesting as other races where we're seeing it go into the. Didn't one race go to like the 11th ballot or something insane? Was that 2017?
Yeah, it was 2017. Yeah.
So I don't think we're not going to be seeing that, but we're going to be seeing. I think we're going to be surprised here. It's just in what way are we going to be surprised? Does Poilievre route Charest even in Quebec? Does Charest at least pull through in Quebec? Does he pull through anywhere else? Those are the little things that I'll be watching for here in 10 or so minutes when the results roll out.
The Quebec results are interesting, especially watching the Quebec election right now, because we're seeing a bit of a skyrocket in the polls of Éric Duhem and the Conservative Party in Quebec. Now, of course, there's no relationship between the Conservative Party of Quebec and the Conservative Party of Canada as it operates in Quebec on the federal level. But there is some connection between the philosophies of Éric Duhem and Pierre Poilievre. They definitely do seem to be talking to similarly culturally aggrieved voters. And it does seem like there is actually a ripe political space to be selling that message in Quebec, which is very odd. It's a province that has been dominated by federalism versus separatism for a long time, and there just wasn't any other political message that could dominate that, or that could question the dominance of those two narratives. Now it looks like there is something else breaking through. There is another message that people are willing to listen to, and so the Liberals cannot guarantee themselves as being the only anti-sovereigntist vote in Quebec. They also can't guarantee that they had difficulty guaranteeing themselves as the only progressive vote as well with the rise of Jack Layton. So we're seeing, and that could. It's doubtful that the NDP will ever rise again in Quebec under the reign of Jagmeet Singh, but it's not impossible that the left could be split at least with the bloc in Quebec, and so we definitely see a possibility where Quebec is where Justin Trudeau's majority chances lay. It could be where Pierre Poilievre's majority chances lay. If he has a breakthrough there, he doesn't have to be winning as many seats in Ontario as you would expect. So
I
at
don't
least
know
form a
about
minority
that.
Government.
And the only reason I don't know about how well he would do in Quebec in a general is just the quality of his French, and it's good. Like he could hold his own somewhat with Jean Charest, but he doesn't sound like a francophone. His turns of phrase aren't like francophones would say, and I know that from listening to him even as an anglophone. Like I can hear the difference, and I know that Jean Charest made quick work of him in the French debate. That was the only debate where Jean Charest dominated. Purely because of his command of the language. So like you and I don't care about that, but I find that Quebecers maybe care a little bit more if somebody can speak French really well or not. And so I find if you can't speak French as well, I find sometimes you don't do as well in that particular province. I mean, trends can be usurped. Like he could completely change it and maybe people won't care and they'll just vote for him anyway. I mean, like God, we saw Quebec go first for the Bloc and then for the NDP in 2011 and then go for the Liberals in 2015. So, anything can happen. Anything's possible.
But it's also, Quebec is on a bit of a nice edge, and there's a lot of 3 or 4 way splits in Quebec where the Conservatives are just strong enough to eat into the Bloc Quebecois so that the Liberals can come up the middle, but they're not strong enough to beat the Liberals. I mean, if you don't need to move that greatly to swing at least a few seats. And Justin Trudeau's strategy is clearly, I'm going to run exactly the same election as many times as possible until I get those 15 extra seats in Quebec, and then I'll have my majority. That's clearly his strategy. He's not changing anything. He's just going to roll the dice over and over and over again. If Pierre Poilievre can throw a wrench in that strategy, he could end up being prime minister by default, just because we get so exhausted that he ends up forming some sort of deal to get in, the same way that Harper did in 2006. You could in 2006 you could have plausibly said, well, Martin should have stayed on. There wasn't an outright majority for Harper, and there was no real natural ally for Harper in the House. but people were just so exhausted with the Liberals that they gave him a chance. And once he got his old white knuckles on the steering wheel of power, he never gave up. We can definitely see a world where Pierre Poilievre would do the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just it, and people forget that is in fact possible in our system. Like it is very possible for a prime minister who just lost a general to still command the confidence of Parliament if he can somehow cobble together a coalition. And now that doesn't happen very often, but I mean, so it actually did happen. I mean, it's happened a couple of times. It happened in BC. It happened in 2017. It happened in Ontario in 85, I think it was. It was David Peterson versus Bill Davis. And I believe the PCs won one or two more seats. And then, but the NDP, there was no way they were going to support the PCs since they'd been in power since, I believe at that time, since the 40s or something. Like people forget there was a PC, like many decades of PC rule during the 20th century in Ontario. And the only way that got broken was by the NDP supporting David Peterson's Liberals, who ironically for themselves were on their way cruising to a majority until Bob Rae came out of nowhere. So that was funny in and of itself. But all that to say, under our system, just because somebody wins the most seats, if they're one or two seats ahead of another party and then they don't command an absolute majority in Parliament, they can 100% team up with another party, and even the party that quote unquote wins the plurality of seats won't form government. So, I mean, Pierre Poilievre's a pretty cynical fellow. He's been in this job since he was, 24, 25. He's a political animal. That's his modus operandi. He's got people on his team who are political animals. That's their modus operandi. So any way that he can, any way that he can sort of claw his way into power, I think he will. I mean, I don't think the NDP are going to prop up a Poilievre government under any circumstances. But then I suppose people said that about Harper too. So you never really know. But I mean, I think it's just another reason, number one, why we need electoral reform. Then we wouldn't have governments eking through with 32% of the vote. But number two, I think it's you made a very interesting comparison there between the Quebec Conservatives and the federal Conservatives as they operate in Quebec, and obviously there's no relation. But like they're speaking to very similar groups of people, and you actually are right about some of those vote splits, particularly in and around Quebec City and in that region. They could come through the middle in a lot of those votes. The only sort of factor that's going to be important to watch is Yves-François Blanchet, how well he does. And how many seats he can hold on to, because I think he's Poilievre's biggest thorn in Quebec, and I think probably helps them a little bit in the vote splits. But then I think they also help him with some of his vote splits. Like when they won big in 2019 there, they won with less of the popular vote than Duceppe got in 2015, and he only got he didn't even get enough for official party status in 2015. So it's all about math, baby, and the math breaks down different ways, different times, with different strategies.
Yeah, well, and I think that we're gonna see how the first round results go in. But if Pierre Poilievre can win a resounding victory on the first ballot without borrowing support from Leslyn Lewis's social conservatives, it allows him to not owe allegiance to the most problematic parts of the base, in particular in parts of Quebec. I mean, like it's the abortion issue that kills the conservative cause in Quebec, and they're talking about secularism all the time. They've moved so far away from those religiously conservative, socially conservative values that there are people who, because of their intolerance towards ethnic minorities, you think, well, they'd be the classic Tory voter, but they actually still hold some. They still hold some relatively liberal social views that they cannot square with a vote for the Conservative Party, and that sort of opens a space for the Bloc Québécois in the racist but still somewhat woke crowd. It's a very weird avenue that doesn't exist in any other province, and it's an avenue that can be closed at any time if the conservatives are willing to invest in. And it definitely takes, like, as you said, the French skills. It takes focusing on those issues but and pivoting away from some stuff that traditionally the leaders of the Conservative Party had to at least pander to a little bit. If Pierre Poilievre can elevate himself from that discussion because he doesn't feel like he owes his victory to social conservatives in any real way, it puts him in a much stronger position, not just in Quebec, but in lots of, you could say, the whole of suburban Canada, really. It puts the Conservatives back in play in a way that they haven't been in a long time. The Liberals are obviously going to try and tie him with a lot of detestable social conservative ideas, but it remains to be seen whether it's going to stick. I mean, they've done that several times in a row. Is it really going to work the third time around?
Here's a question
There's no
for
guarantee.
You. If you're Justin Trudeau and you're trying to beat this guy, he just had a retreat with his cabinet ministers. If you're in the cabinet room with Justin Trudeau and let's say his, Katie Telford or some of his staffers, and you're sitting down to discuss strategy, what is the strategy you would use to defeat this guy?
To defeat Pierre Poilievre.
Mm-hmm. It's easy to say, how do you lose to him? Because there's a million ways he could lose to him. How do you win?
But do I have to keep Justin Trudeau as the leader of the Liberal Party?
Yes. For this thought exercise, yes.
Well, I do think that it is all about tying him to the wrong side of issues that work in his base. So it is about showing that he actually does not support the common man, that his austerity politics would have taken away things like CERB, that it would have put your grandma out on the street. It would have put your high school student son years away from university. It would have caused that this man in power in a time of crisis would have had terrible consequences. I think that you have to start fixing a lot of these sociological problems that Pierre Poilievre is identifying, or at least start talking seriously about them. You have to walk away from defending the economy all the time. And you have to admit, and that's the difficult part for Justin Trudeau, is I think it's possible, but it's not really in his wheelhouse, because I think he wants to present a world where he is personally responsible for all the goodness in our economy, without accepting all of the badness. I mean, in the truth of the matter is that Justin Trudeau's relatively impotent in the way that our economy functions. And it's the whims of the American president are way more powerful. I mean, like our whole vehicle industry was saved by an EV clause that the U.S. Senate inserted into a bill to combat climate change, and that had nothing to do with Canada, and yet it could have fundamentally destroyed Ontario's economy if the Americans had chosen that. But Justin Trudeau can't stand up on a stage and say, I'm going to be the best prime minister because I know how to jerk off the Americans better than Pierre Poilievre, which would be an honest statement, but he can't say that. So he has to create this sort of fiction where he's trying to say that I'm the best manager, and I'm more competent than him. And Pierre Poilievre can of course poke holes in it all he wants, but they're having a false debate. I think Justin Trudeau needs to start identifying the systemic problems and start addressing the fact that maybe we are too dependent on the Americans. Maybe our system is inherently unequal. Maybe there are real problems, and I am the vehicle for change. Instead, he's maintaining a fantasy that Pierre Poilievre is too deft at destroying, and it's a massive vulnerability.
Yeah, I mean, I think where the Liberals have to be very careful. Like, I'm not saying that they shouldn't be using some of what they usually do, where they bring up things that people have said or done in the past, because I think that still matters. I think they have to be very careful about resting their entire campaign approach on that. That's where I think it becomes dangerous. I think what you said there about Pierre Poilievre, if he gets in, like, you know, he's an acolyte of Thatcher. And, you know, you and I know who Thatcher is, Margaret Thatcher. And so a lot of people know who Margaret Thatcher is, but not a lot of people know what kind of politician she was, particularly those that didn't live in the UK or aren't politicos like us. So you can't just go out there and say, he's like Thatcher 2.0. You have to explain what that means in layman's terms. So you say, like you said, you know, he would get in and he might cut social programs. He doesn't believe in a role for government in social programs. He believes in the voluntary generosity of people, as he said in his own words. He doesn't like the current structure of the way that government services are delivered. That's dangerous. He's not going to. He wouldn't have spent on, like you said, CERB, the way that Justin Trudeau would have. He would have let people go out of work. So, but you have to also combine that with his past. You know, like some people might remember that in 2008, on the very day of the Stephen Harper's residential school apology, he went on an Ottawa Talk radio show and wondered, do you think we're getting all of this value for money? I think we have to engender hard work in Indigenous people instead. Like, and then of course he had to apologize the next day for it. But that's the kind of stuff that you bring up, but then you combine it with, and also he doesn't care about you. He doesn't care about the common man. Really? You think he's going to be your hero? He's had the same job since he was 24. You really think that he's going to be the one that's going to go in and change everything the way it's been benefiting him for the past almost 20 years? That's the argument that you go in and make. The difficult thing is that the messenger is Justin Trudeau.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it just doesn't work with him as a messenger. Yeah.
Now, but on the flip side, so let's change the thought exercise. So let's talk about, if not Justin Trudeau, number one, who replaces him, and if so, what strategy would you adopt? Or sorry, depending on who you pick, what strategy would you adopt? I mean,
well, that's why I know you're going to laugh at me, but I think that the natural alternative is Jagmeet Singh, and he's someone that at least speaks to. He has a personal story of someone from a marginalized community that is now moving up the ranks and finally repairing a social injustice. So it's just inherent in his own identity. It's the same message that Justin Trudeau is delivering, but not delivered by someone who is benefiting from the system of oppression he is himself critiquing. So it's a way better connection of message. And Jagmeet Singh's a relatively well-off background, so it doesn't quite work with the common man strategy, sadly. But I don't really see too many people that could fit it better. But he does have a decent way of connecting with real people and connecting with their real problems, feeling their emotions, seeing empathetic. It's just Jagmeet Singh with a really well condensed social program, a really well condensed list of social policies that stick is 3 to 5 things rather than his usual plate of 14 small items that he's begging the Liberals to enact. It's a clear agenda, and of course it's all the resources of both the Liberals and the NDP behind him. So long as the Liberals and the NDP are sniping at each other, there's not going to be the sort of combined effort on the left that I think is required to defeat Pierre Poilievre. So long as the Liberals think that the best case scenario is saying, you know,
I just got to jump in.
You jump in.
Well, I'm jumping in just because I think the results are coming in here, folks. So, or at least something's happening on the stage here. There's a fella standing on the stage. There's a lot of fellas who look similar to one another standing on the stage. And then there's Rob Batherson, Conservative Party President Rob Batherson there on the far left. I'm embarrassed to admit I don't know the names of everybody else. I think one of them is Ian Brody. Who is
I can see Ian Brody there.
Which one is he, the bald guy that's beside Rob Batherson?
Correct.
There we go. So I know those two people. The other two, I'm embarrassed to say, listeners, I don't know who they are, but they're on the stage now and they look like they have something to announce. So 2 seconds, we're just going to listen in. And it's all over.
Yeah, first round. It makes sense. It had to.
Wow.
Be okay. Are they gonna actually say the number?
Wow. He got 68%, Jacob. 68% of the vote. 68.15% of the vote.
Yeah.
Charest scrambled together a meager 16%. Wow.
Nice.
Wow.
I'm glad that my sources were at least correct on this one, but I also don't think it was hard to predict.
Holy cow, that is a rout. Well, what's our reaction to that? I mean, I guess we just talked about our reaction to that because we knew the inevitable.
Yeah, it's
Holy cow.
a solid, well-defined victory that he owes to no one. So no one but himself.
Yeah, I mean,
It's a pure
he's got a
cult of
gift.
personality. Yeah, yeah.
He's got a gift, and that's the most horrifying thing about him. And I think that's why Chris Curtis, when he was here earlier, for those of you that weren't here before, Chris Curtis from the Rover joined us for a little bit, and he was saying that that's why he finds Poilievre so interesting, not because he particularly likes him. I mean, I think he said he finds him despicable, but he finds him all the same so interesting because he's so good at galvanizing all of this support. He ran the perfect campaign that the grassroots wanted to see run. He spoke to the concerns of the party. He looked people in the eye who, whether they were reading BS on the internet, whether they had nothing, whether, you know, whatever it was, he looked them in the eye and he said, I could help you. And they believed him. And we're going to see now how he imports that to the general.
Do you want to listen to his speech?
Yeah, let's put on the speech here. He's just doing some hand waving, and I think he's going to speak here. And
okay, yeah, we'll keep talking. Sorry.
His wife's going to speak. Okay.
Nous avons grandi très similairement.
Okay, we'll have to cover this later, Liam. But this very clearly, we can see the whole Pierre Poilievre campaign in microcosm in this speech. I'm actually kind of amazed at how well this is going. It's a much better political communicator than I would expect from the usual political spouse. I know she was a Senate staffer before, but no, you can keep her on. I was just talking over the French.
Well, we'll talk over it. I think we've gotten the gist of it here, but I mean, yeah, I mean, you just summed it up. Like it's a very good microcosm of the entire Poilievre campaign. You know, instantly going to those that rags to riches kind of story, and how hard work got her there.
Not necessarily rags to riches. I think the more important idea is just to show that they're grounded, that they know I think I can see more the contrast in comparison between them and the most obvious political, like Sophie Trudeau and Justin Trudeau, like the Laurentian elite versus these two, very humble beginnings. Okay, Pierre Poilievre is going to speak. Okay, sorry, let's.
Yeah.
For almost half of our nation's existence.
Okay, I'm just going to talk over this part. just to respond to your point, Jacob. Yeah, I think rags to riches maybe was a little clumsy, but what I meant by that is like I got where I was because I worked hard, and you don't get anything unless you work hard, and that's the core messaging of people like Pierre Poilievre. Pull yourself up your bootstraps and work. That's the classic kind of Thatcherite. That's exactly where he's coming from. It's his campaign in microcosm, and he did it very well. His wife begun providing a personal anecdote of how she got where she is, and talked about how he got where he is, and even was able to point at them in the audience. So it's a very relatable human anecdote, right? And he's very good at relating to the normal person, whether we like it or not. We need to respond to this guy, because he's so good at speaking to the regular person. And that's the biggest danger. That's the biggest danger.
When Sophie Gregoire Trudeau and when Justin Trudeau addressed the Liberal convention, what message have we ever heard besides, we're the most perfect people ever. Look at us, we're so beautiful and rich, and we've never suffered a day in our lives. This is the contrast couldn't be more obvious. And it's interesting that they're going there to draw it. It's a strong distinction, and it's well spoken.
We'll go back to the speech here, going back to Pierre's speech. Okay, so he did pay lip service. He kept it relatively classy.
Well, and also mentioned something that happened 20 years ago. It's the assumption being you shouldn't have come out. You should have stayed dead, basically.
Exactly. I think this is. I mean, if folks want to watch the speech, they can tune in on YouTube and follow along. Sure. But I mean, I think we already know what he's going to say. It's very, very directed about putting control back into the individual's life. That's his entire message. It is a libertarian message, if there ever was one. Like I said, this guy's not a fan of an expanded social state. He's going to go after. You're blind if you think he's going to go after the expanded social state, at least to some extent. And I think for the left wing, the best thing that we can do is talk about, refocus our messaging to socioeconomic issues primarily, number one. Number two, we have to talk in a normal way. We can't be over rehearsing talking points anymore and sounding like a bunch of robots. We have to talk like regular people. Number three, we need to be speaking to ways we can make the individual's life better, but we need to frame it in such a way that government can be there for people, that government can take care of people. That's the contrast that we need to align. Pierre Poilievre is trying to frame this as though government is in people's way. And I mean, there's certainly times where the bureaucracy can be in people's way, for sure. But it's not as though social progress and social programs are, anathema to what will help individual people get out of the rut that they're in. The trouble is that currently the Liberal Party would rather sound like it's defending the status quo, aka neoliberalism, and that was Hillary Clinton's problem as well. They share two major things in common in that they tell regular people, no, everything's fine, everything's great. But it's not fine and it's not great. And so it's like, what are you going to do differently? Well, childcare. It's like, okay, that is pretty great if you have kids, but a lot of people don't. So what else are you going to do? Well, we'll see. It's like they're completely invisible. So we need to refocus now. We need to regroup. I don't know if the solution is, like you say, Jacob, uniting the left. I think that could be a whole podcast in itself, and we should definitely get that together. But what are your thoughts?
You got to do what they did in France, man. The new popular union of leftist parties. They won the parliamentary elections against Macron's neoliberals when he was expecting to have another majority in parliament. It's very simple. Unite the left and you win. But I'm actually more interested in doing a little bit of meta-analysis on how Pierre Poilievre and his wife were speaking about each other. Because when you were listening to Pierre Poilievre listing off his congratulations to the other contenders, did you hear him mention the spouses of anyone besides Leslyn Lewis? I think he was...
I didn't hear that, which, come to think of it, is a little bit
it was just
weird.
Leslyn, he thanks Leslyn Lewis, and then he thanks her husband for supporting her. And then,
what if that was deliberate?
Well, because it makes me wonder, because before he has his wife come out like, and I'm here supporting Pierre Poilievre, standing by his side, like very, very obviously playing that social conservative role. I don't think it's evident, or sorry, I don't think it's planned at all. I don't think it's conscious. I think it's just indicative of the way that he thinks.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that people don't realize about Poilievre is they think that he's tacking so far to the right and blah, blah. It's like, no, this is who he is. This is who he's always been. We can't treat him like he's putting on an act. He is doing exactly what he has always wanted to do, which means
in his head it's still 1950. Yeah.
And we can joke about that, but we need to find somebody who is also doing exactly what they want to do. We don't need any more rich sons of prime ministers leading the leftist coalition. We need somebody whose entire passion has been around supporting workers, around supporting getting people off of their backs and into homes instead of being on the streets, lying on a sidewalk at night. We need to support people who can get people who can maybe get people warmed up to the idea of non-market housing. We need somebody who espouses all of these ideas and has been fighting for these ideas all of their life. We don't need another person who worked in business for 30 years or who worked as a lawyer for 30 years and that's all they did and they were rich their whole life and now they're going to fake caring about the little guy. We need somebody who's actually experienced being the little guy themselves. Because I think that is one thing about Pierre Poilievre that, yes, we joke about the fact that he was an MP since he was 24, and sure, that certainly made him privileged, that's for sure. But what about before he was 24? I don't think his parents were too wealthy, and he grew up in Western Canada, and that's quite a libertarian place. You need to be able to respond to someone who feels that they can help the individual in a way that leftists support and that Canadians also support. That's the challenge here.
Yeah, and that's why I keep bringing up Jagmeet Singh is a much more natural messenger for that sort of movement, because in Justin Trudeau, he's in a position where in order to be successful, he does need to critique parts of our society to win. He needs to give leftists a general project, a general vision of how he wants to evolve and improve society. But he can't really critique society that harshly because he's the number one beneficiary of the way the system is currently set up.
Yeah.
And someone like Jagmeet Singh, especially when he's talking in Quebec, and he's like experienced the racism. He's experienced the way that our system grinds people down that look and act like that look and come from his communities. He's someone who can make a much more furious and grounded critique of the system, and so therefore, when he offers solutions, they seem more realistic. When Justin Trudeau offers solutions to problems, I think they're always going to sound inevitably contrived, because like, what does he really care whether the solutions work or don't work? I mean, like the first scandal of his reign was over nannies, getting exorbitant allowances for his children. So does he really care about childcare? I mean, he's made it a cornerstone of his evolutionary response, but clearly it didn't really matter to him. His children were going to have the best possible care, regardless if childcare was a national policy or not. It didn't hit him home at all. And so when he talks about it, he's always going to be talking about it in a very abstract way that doesn't connect to people. And as you said,
the thing about Justin Trudeau is, and you've brought up this point before, other commentators have brought up this point before, Justin Trudeau is at his best when he's fired up. But the saddest part is he only ever gets fired up about the select wedge issue of the campaign. Exactly. And I mean, that is his greatest asset, but I would say it's also his biggest drawback, because he didn't live the experience of sleeping on the sidewalk, because he didn't live the experience of struggling to pay for exorbitant childcare prices, because he didn't have the experience of growing up in rural Saskatchewan, maybe with two modest farmers, two modest school teachers. He lived a very different life. And similarly with Jean Charest, he lived a very different life. We need somebody from the left who has, at a minimum, maybe at least lower middle class, so they can at least, like, not that that's struggling at all, but like, my God, that has to be like the highest bar. Like, we need somebody who has actually lived and experienced that. We need a person of color, if we can, who can connect with people like Jagmeet can. When we've seen him speak about it before and how it's affected him personally, the way he's able to connect with people. I don't know if anything in hell is going to happen to allow a merger to happen. I think electoral reform would come before that. But we need a firebrand. The left needs a firebrand. We need an enigma, and we don't have that right now, and it's a huge problem.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. He's definitely Pierre Poilievre represents a very profound challenge to a status quo that Justin Trudeau he never really can be. I mean, he can try to refrain. The best he can do, I think, is try to bring ordinary people along with the power of empathy that he clearly has shown on multiple occasions. But it's very, with the tight sort of message control that he has, it just never really allows him to be human. That's not going to be too possible. I mean, you see when Chrystia Freeland, who's been the main fall guy for him for the last few months on the economy, tries to talk to people about, we have the best economic situation in the G7, and that really doesn't offer anyone any sort of solution or project going through, that doesn't give them any sort of moral comfort or moral support. Pierre Poilievre, when he talks about, me and my wife, we were these poor street urchins, and we pulled ourselves up by the bootstraps, it at least is giving people some sort of hope. It's giving them some sort of passage. As I said a long time ago, I mean, the fact that he is self-evidently flawed. He isn't as he has the sort of nasally voice. He has a sort of nerdy schoolboy look. The fact that a man like him can aspire to power is in and of itself a little bit empowering for his audience. It's maybe a fantasy. It's definitely a fantasy. For the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps is a fantasy, but at least it's a plan. It's like, if you're down on your luck, it gives you something to do. It gives you some hope. The the liberal messaging is basically like, sit down and wait for the people that are better than you to fix the problems that you have in your life. It's, we are these spectacular elites. We went to these fancy universities. We know all the answers. We have done everything correct already. We foresaw this inflationary spiral, and we enacted all the policies ahead of time. You just have to sit down and wait, which is, that might be the better policy, but it's not the better message. You need to give people something to do. You need to give people something to look forward to, some hope. And this government is failing to do that on a fundamental level.
Saddest part of it all is that that's what he was supposed to do. Like you, me, I think a whole lot of other people were really fired up when he came on the scene because he had a platform that, had it been actually enacted, would have been transformational. Of course, it would have been a start. Like there's always more to do, but it would have been transformational. And the first thing he did in the first couple of years of his term was back away from a good chunk of his key promises. And he wound up just being another boring centrist liberal, but he happened to talk a little bit more progressive. That's the only, sure, maybe he changed people's terminology a little bit and how they cover and talk about certain issues. And there's a handful of things that he's done that have changed the country for the better. Like, I'm not one of those people that's going to say he's done nothing, but my gosh, he's done way less than we thought. He's not been as nearly as transformational as we thought. And not only that, like I always say, he is now becoming synonymous with the status quo. He is now becoming synonymous with neoliberalism, with the failings of the sort of the neoliberal order that we've been sort of the line we've been towing since the 80s, since the oil crisis and inflation in the oil crisis in the 70s and inflation in the 80s. And so what are we going to do? Put someone else in that's going to talk at you and now children, you just go and shut your mouths while we fix the problem? Or are you going to actually say, you know what, I know you're angry because I'm angry too, and here's what I'm going to do to fix it? And even if those answers aren't, I mean, I'm not saying that we should have a candidate that BS's people, but let me look at Poilievre. He's BS'd people with a good chunk of his promises, but at least he's promised to do something. If we don't have a response to that other than to say, you can't do that, then we just look like we're doing nothing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, in the 20s and 30s, when there was a similar surge in far right politics, a lot of the primary interest from that was from young men, people that very recently had just gotten the right to vote without property qualifications, but also people that you could just call them like the edgelords of their day. The interest in fascism was that it was cool and fashionable, that it was, and in some sense, the fact that the establishment of the intellectuals, that the powers that be hated it so much, it only made it more interesting, because it was the same institutions that hated these far-right politicians were also the people that were seen to be failing. And, we can say that, obviously Pierre Poilievre is not as dangerous as that segment of far-right politics, but he's also adjacent to it. He's willing to touch it, like guys like Diagonal on. It's the fact that we don't take it seriously, or the fact that we think that it's a bit of a joke, doesn't make it any less dangerous. In fact, sometimes the joke can empower it more, that it gives people the cognitive dissonance necessary to engage with it. And I definitely see a lot of guys in our demographic, Liam, young guys like us, who I would normally have suspected would be liberals, that are willing to attach their wagons to this Pierre Poilievre train. I'm mixing metaphors, but they're willing to support Pierre Poilievre because he's the one that's saying, everything is fucked up and I have a solution. And even though they wouldn't normally be predisposed to his solution, the simple fact of the matter that he's willing to criticize the system in the first place is what activates them, is what interests them. Because they also, and when they see all the criticism of him from people that they innately distrust, they start thinking, oh, you know what, maybe this guy is onto something. Maybe, all the people I hate him. So therefore, the two negatives cancel out, and this guy must be a positive. That's what they're thinking. And I think that edgelord sort of, I'm doing this to own the libs. I don't genuinely believe this. It can produce a political force that we don't think is necessarily rational, but definitely exists and can exist in enough quantity to bring these sorts of movements to power. And that's disturbing. It's something we need to focus on. So it's not, you can't just say, oh, this is a joke. We shouldn't take it seriously. We shouldn't dignify it with a response. That seems to be what the Liberals are doing right now. We're not going to dignify Pierre Poilievre with the response. Hopefully they'll respond differently now that he's the official leader. Hopefully they'll start attacking him. Hopefully they'll start taking him to task. But you got to do something. You can't just say, oh, he's going to put his foot in his mouth. He's going to dig his own grave. He absolutely isn't going to dig his own grave. In fact, the more that he bungles in public, and the more that leftists pile onto him, that could only improve his popularity. You have to start actually presenting an alternative for people to park their frustration and anger.
Well, I want to pick up on something you said there about the cognitive dissonance. And I think the classic example that people always cite is, because it's so easy to, is Donald Trump, right? Nobody in hell thought he was going to win. Nobody. I didn't think he was going to win. Everybody thought it was a complete joke. So everybody treated it like a joke. But when they treated it like a joke, there's all the memes, right, of, Donald Trump and Hillary, Donald Trump, he's such a crazy, wacky misogynist, right? But it was, all the disgusting things he said, for some people, it just didn't register because it was treated like a joke. So they didn't take it seriously. And some people probably thought, I'm just going to stay home. I'm not really emboldened to vote for Hillary, and Trump's not going to win anyway. It's just two milquetoast options. I'm going to stay home. And then a lot of the Obama coalition, especially in the Rust Belt, the old Obama coalition went, well, you know what? Hillary's sitting here telling me that everything's fine how it is. I know it's not, because I've lost my job and I lost my benefits and I lost this and I lost that. And maybe Trump says some things he shouldn't, but I'm going to vote for him. And, I'm not saying this isn't my view, by the way, listeners, but this is the view of a lot of the people that voted for him. And this is the view of a lot of people that will vote and have already voted for Pierre Poilievre. Well, maybe sometimes, he probably shouldn't have shaken Jeremy Mackenzie's hand, but maybe he didn't know. And you know what? He's better than what we've got. And even Lisa Raitt, when we were listening to Lisa Raitt on Cursive Politics with Scott Reed and David Hurley, the two former Liberal staffers that had that podcast, one of the things that was said by Lisa Raitt was, she didn't say anything directly about Pierre, but she was kind of hinting that wasn't really the way she wanted to see the party go. But then she also said, well, I'm still going to vote Conservative because it's the best option out there.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
So it's so if we don't find somebody who can sit down with the average person and relate to them, and not only relate to them, but take their concerns seriously and are seen to be doing that, we're hooped.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. There's no comparison necessarily with what happened in the 20s and 30s here. Obviously, all circumstances are different, but in general, when a marginal faction or a radical faction takes over, it's not necessarily true that they are somehow a silent majority, or that they actually were secretly more supported, and when they do their final coup and take over, that the population reveals itself to actually be more sympathetic to their cause than they ever were. No, it's that the vast majority of people are just apathetic, and or they hate the alternatives more than the radical faction that takes over. And so, in a sense, what Pierre Poilievre has to do is he has to keep this very strong contingent behind him. Obviously, this is a really powerful victory he just achieved. He has to keep this contingent behind him, and he has to turn off voters. He doesn't have to get more people. He just needs to make sure that there isn't a huge number of contrarians that are coalescing behind a leftist alternative. If he can get people apathetic, as I said, in the conservative mindset, he looks like a moderate now. If he can keep that image, if he can make it look like, well, I'm a conservative, but I'm not the worst type of conservative. I'm not really that dangerous, or the people that say that I'm dangerous are people that you hate just as much. He can keep people on side, and he can keep just enough people on side to win, and turn enough people off, turn them away from politics that they're never going to be a problem for him. It's just about keeping people at home, not necessarily about bringing them out to the polls for him.
Exactly.
And, yeah.
Exactly. And, that's the real danger that happens, particularly with the long tooth of incumbency. And I mean, sometimes a leadership change can help. Sometimes it can't, as we saw with Kim Campbell. She was supposed to solve all the problems Mulroney had, and John Turner was supposed to solve all the problems Pierre Trudeau had. How did that go? Right. So I caution us on thinking the instant solution is a leadership change for the sake of it. I think if we're doing a leadership change, it has to be to the right leader. We can't just put a milquetoast cabinet minister from Ontario in there who can barely cobble together a sentence in French, which I think among this crowd, there's a real risk of that happening if there were to be a leadership race. Now, he said last week,
you're talking about the Liberal candidates, sorry. You're talking about the Liberal cabinet? I'm
talking about the Liberals now, sorry. Justin Trudeau said last week in his meeting with cabinet ministers that he did intend to stay on. I mean, of course, he's going to say that he intends to stay on. But, the fact that he's reiterating that, I mean, I've been hearing, I was listening to Peter Mansbridge's podcast there, and he was saying that according to his sources, it was Bruce Anderson who was on Peter Mansbridge's podcast. According to his sources, a lot of prospective Liberal candidates have sort of already shut it down because he was serious. And
Justin Trudeau told his cabinet and their cabinet retreat this past weekend that he was going to stay for the next election as well. That's
what I just said.
Okay. Sorry.
You silly man. But so the point being that, who's going to be as galvanizing in Quebec as him? We don't like him, but who's going to be as galvanizing in Quebec as him right now out of the Liberals? Nobody. There's nobody, obviously, in the Liberals, or to be honest, the NDMP, maybe Boulder-East, but he'd have to increase his name profile outside of Quebec. There's nobody as galvanizing as Trudeau is right now. So that's kind of the catch-22 the Liberals are in. They're like, yeah, well, we could have a leadership race, or we could try to stab this guy in the back, but what's the point? He's the best we've got. And so, if that's a real advantage to Pierre Poilievre, if he can get enough disaffected Liberals to stay home and go, well, I don't want to vote for Poilievre, but I'm so sick of this guy, it could be very dangerous. At the same time, one thing that is true about Justin Trudeau, and I do believe this is true, is he performs surprisingly well under pressure. I mean, it's not an infinite reservoir of performing well under pressure. Incumbency is going to catch up with you eventually, but whether we like it or not, maybe they're not particularly good at governing, but they are damn good at campaigning. And particularly if he's under pressure, I don't want to count him out. I don't want to count him out just yet, though I do think if his messaging is everything's fine, the status quo is great, we've done such a great job, why don't you love us as much as we love ourselves, then yeah, he will get absolutely destroyed.
Yeah, I mean, they're good at campaigning, but they can't be good at campaigning forever. And eventually, their luck has to end. It's pretty rare to win 4 in a row, and that's what they're trying to do. So they're already facing an uphill battle, and they're facing it at a time where there could be complete economic ruin. It looks like we're turning the corner on inflation. It looks like things are slowly getting better, but I think we're in the stage of whether we're talking about late stage capitalism, whether we're talking about climate change, we're in the stage of society where we can expect that there's going to be constant and recurring crises of varying and probably increasing degrees. And no one could have possibly predicted COVID. But a lot of people were predicting that there was going to be some sort of pandemic in the future just because of the way that we were living our lives. There's going to definitely be some sort of climate catastrophe. It seems like every year there's some sort of major flood, some sort of huge forest fire. There's going to be challenges that are coming up, and there's definitely, as the inflation shock has shown, there's major problems with our economic system. And a system that demands infinite growth in a finite universe is never going to work permanently to begin with. and it seems to be under constant shock right now. So even if things improve in the midpoint, if we're going to the polls in 2025, the country could be in a lot worse shape. And the BS that Pierre Poilievre is spinning right now may seem like a better alternative than whatever BS Justin Trudeau is. Because if we're in an election where like BC is on fire and the prairies are underwater, and and Justin Trudeau's out here, and we're at war with Russia or something like that, and Justin Trudeau's still going on to the television every night saying everything is fine, I'm still great, I'm gonna fix it all, even though that I am a little bit responsible for the mess to begin with. That's not gonna fly.
Now here's the difference. Here's the difference. If BC is underwater and the prairies are on fire, or whichever order you said, BC on fire, prairies underwater, it could be either or, honestly. I mean, that's
the most disturbing part. It could be either or.
So if these climate catastrophes are happening and he goes on TV and says, I'm so great, then sure, he's going to look like an idiot. But if he goes on and has a solution. Well, here's what I was going to say was, if he goes on and, like, let's say by some miracle inflation gets a little better, it could be harder to make this argument if inflation is still bad. But if he goes on TV and says, this is the reality of climate change, our government has a carbon price that rises on large emitters every year, we send the funds back to you. Pierre Poilievre wants to do absolutely nothing while this is happening. If you elect this guy, he will do absolutely nothing. That will hit way harder if he goes on TV and says that, as opposed to I'm so great. And I think you have to give him a little credit there, where I think he's been very effective at using the carbon tax as a bludgeon. There's a risk it could be used as a bludgeon against him if inflation is still bad. But if it settles down a little bit, he could totally bludgeon Pierre Poilievre, because nobody expects him to have a serious climate plan. That could be Poilievre's Achilles heel. He shut down the abortion thing. He's already said he's pro-choice. I don't know if he's necessarily viewed as like being a super out there, like pride or LGBTQ plus Two-Spirit plus supporter. But he's shut it down way more than Andrew Scheer has. However, we all know he's not going to do anything about climate. We know he's not going to do anything about climate. He doesn't care about that. So particularly if climate change has gotten worse by then, and it's cursed to even say that, but if it has, then Trudeau could absolutely bludgeon him with it. What he has to be careful of is to not trip up on his own arrogance and, of course, the long tooth of incumbency.
Yeah, and that's the problem of having a disunited left. I mean, if there is no alternative save the Liberals, I can see how you can work on that. But
nothing galvanizes the left. Nothing galvanizes the left like a conservative that is popular enough that they could get in and is going to do nothing about climate change. Yeah, but nothing galvanizes the left like that.
But he's not. So I think this is a point especially that needs to be emphasized here, is that the something that the Liberals are doing about climate change is not something that is going to cancel out the effects that are already baked in to changes of the climate.
Obviously not.
I'm
not saying that.
If there's a world where people are thrown from their homes because of some climate catastrophe, an extra carbon tax is going to make their lives worse. And Pierre Poilievre saying I'm going to lift the carbon tax is going to make their lives better. So in that world,
well, that depends. That depends on a few things.
Lifting the carbon tax could actually seem like a rational response to climate change. I mean, that's basically what what the Conservatives are arguing, and it's a point that the Liberals are not responding to.
But that's failed. That's not worked for them.
It
hasn't.
Not yet.
It could if inflation is bad enough. It could. I agree with you.
But it's also working around you see almost every single Western nation lifted their gas. Like they had a holiday on gas taxes due to inflation. I mean, that is a policy that on the face of it seems to be
that's just the Liberal doing nothing about. That's just the Liberals just doing nothing about inflation, though.
Yeah, but they're conceding the point because they don't understand how to actually solve the problem.
No, but that's what I'm agreeing. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Like that's bang on the biggest problem for the Liberals right now, is they've completely fled the field on that. But I disagree. I think where I disagree is that, now the Conservatives are automatically, I think, let's say if there was an election held tomorrow, I absolutely think Poilievre could bludgeon Trudeau with a carbon tax, if an election is held in 2 years, of course, there's a lot of wild cards. We don't know what it's going to be like. But if we're in a world where like people are losing their homes, like look at Pakistan, it's a huge tragedy that you've got so many people displaced, people lost their lives. It's devastating. If I don't know if we're going to be there yet in 2 years, we could be in Canada in some areas on the coast. If that's the case, and you know, like obviously, like the economy is going to be exacerbated by environmental problems. It's only going to get worse as climate change gets worse, right? It becomes more difficult to say. I do agree it becomes more difficult to say that the carbon tax is the best solution, but I disagree that just because the economy is suffering, that Pierre Poilievre would get a pass on doing nothing about climate change. And I include, by the way, some sort of BS environmental plan that does absolutely nothing as doing nothing. Like he could put out a plan like Andrew Scheer put out his like 50-point plan or whatever that did absolutely nothing. But like I don't see how the Conservatives could get a pass in this day and age with what we're seeing, with the images we're seeing. Not to say that the Liberals have been climate heroes. Like I'm not here saying for a minute that, oh, Trudeau's like the best on climate. Like he's done far less than anybody thought he would. But I'm saying if it's him doing far less and Pierre Poilievre doing nothing and climate change has gotten worse, yes, I suppose he's the incumbent. But at the same time, are you really going to elect a guy that's going to do nothing?
But
right?
that's the problem when the Liberals are unwilling to even open the door on redistribution of wealth, when they're unopen to open the door of ending housing as an asset class. They are embarking on a set of policies that make their response to crises like climate change a loser for them. Like when people are become homeless because of a flood, for example, they're not going to offer them new houses. They're not going to give them welfare handles. They're not going to give them a UBI, for example. They're not going to make their lives materially better. Instead, they're going to say, oh, by the way, we need to increase the carbon tax because obviously it's not working well enough because of this big flood. Like you're making their lives worse. And that's why a conservative government can be given a pass on not doing anything about climate change, because there are people here and now that are suffering that the Liberal government is refusing to help.
Here's what I will say is I think you are right if and only if the Liberals can continue to cede ground to Poilievre and the Tories on cost of living. Only if by some miracle, the NDP can force them to do a UBI or something, or if there's some sort of redistribution of wealth, or maybe they use the wealth tax revenue and they redistribute it as some sort of benefit or something like that. Like if they do something, if they seem to be doing something, the impact could be lessened. If they seem to be doing absolutely nothing and then they go, oh, the carbon tax needs to be higher. Sorry, guys, we just have to do it. Then yeah, for sure, they could get clobbered.
Well, exactly. That's what we keep talking about, just transition. And like the Justin Trudeau's just transition has basically been, I'll put a giant finger to Alberta, middle finger to Alberta, and pretend that that's somehow just. I mean, obviously, us Albertans, we screwed ourselves over by heavily investing in this resource that is ruining the world, and we knew it was going to run out from the very beginning. But at the ordinary people who've invested their whole lives and savings into the industry are not personally morally at fault for that, and we need to find some solution that's going to protect them. Otherwise, of course, they're right for the picking for someone like Pierre Poilievre and the fantasies that he can sell them.
For sure, yeah, you're bang on, sir.
I mean, like there's guys like Jason Kenney is saying, "Oh, I know that we can't produce oil, but I want to make sure that the last barrel of oil sold is an Albertan barrel of oil." Like that's the level of fantasy that's being delivered here. But the basic sentiment of that is like we acknowledge that what we're doing is harmful to the world, but we also acknowledge that we are benefiting from that system. And until you're changing the equation so that we can benefit just as much by helping the world, we're going to continue harming it. even if it's intentional. And
yeah.
the Liberals don't really have a solution to that besides just finger wagging and moralizing, but moralizing doesn't put food on the table.
That's right. That's right. And I mean, you're bang on. Like, that's the thing is, I mean, people forget how structural capitalism is, right? So if you're presented,
yeah, exactly. It's a system that everyone's invited to buy into. That's what liberals need. Everyone needs to be able to buy into the solution of saving the planet, which is not
but
being
given. I was more so going to use it to illustrate the point that it's structural in the sense that, like you were just saying, if you have an industry that is lucrative, it's lucrative, and it's not going to be that lucrative for much longer, but it's still lucrative. And if you don't do things like ending fossil fuel subsidies, and if you don't do things like a just transition for workers from, say, the oil sands to maybe working in some sort of green technology, then yeah, absolutely, it will continue to be an oil province until the very last second it cannot. Until the very last minute, or perhaps as the world is getting destroyed, they'll still be pumping out press releases from Jason Kenney's war room about how great the oil industry is and how it's actually clean and everything's fine. Because at the end of the day, like that's been their bread and butter. They are an oil province, and if you don't give them another reason to transition away from that, if you, like you said, give them the middle finger, it's not really helpful for anybody. And I mean, I do think he was never really helped to begin with in Alberta, just purely because of his last name, but he also hasn't done himself any favors at all. We don't ever hear him talk about really transition at all. Maybe other than in vague terms, maybe during a campaign, we've never seen any plan for how he's going to transition those workers from the fossil fuel industry into an industry that helps us tackle climate change.
No, he needs to actually invest in the province. He needs to invest in places that are going to lose their industries. But in order to invest, he needs to get the money from somewhere. And he's not willing to raise taxes on the parts of society that need to have their taxes significantly raised.
Yeah,
so it's
because neoliberalism and capital.
The money is not magically going to come from from thin air. That's obviously what his infrastructure bank was supposed to be. It didn't freaking work. You got to try some redistribution. I mean, that's the most annoying thing about the whole Alberta controversy is like with Norway, a country that's very similar size and population of Alberta, and a very similar size and resources. When they save their money correctly, they're able to decrease production while substantially increasing their sovereign wealth fund, and now they're well invested for years. And Albertans didn't do that. All of the profit from the resource went to a very small segment of society and a lot of foreigners, and it was essentially lost. But what that basically has created is a substantially unjust distribution of wealth that needs to be resolved. Yeah. And that's what this government is unwilling to touch. And it's the power structures that in fact defends. It's the pinnacle of those power structures. And a government that's always willing to take a meeting from SNC-Lavalin and change the very function of our legal system on a whim from them is not a government that can be credibly trusted to fundamentally restructure our systems of capital and power. But that's what we actually need.
Yep. And you know what? At this time, I'd like to, so we're about 7 minutes to 10 Atlantic here, because the Atlantic is important, you see, so I have to lead with that.
yes, exactly.
We're about 7 minutes to 9 everywhere else, I think, where most people are anyway, or in Ontario and Quebec. So we wanted to, the center of the universe, so we wanted to open up the floor to people if they had anything to share on this discussion. You should see a little request to speak button there somewhere, and if you have anything to share, you're certainly welcome to share your thoughts. So I'll pause a few seconds there if anybody wants to jump in. But okay, we'll fill airtime. But if anybody wants to jump in, they can. But I mean, I think this was a good, pretty much breakdown of what ails us. It's everything's structural. There's no gumption in the country, so nobody changes anything, and then that's what allows bozos like Poilievre to potentially become prime minister. That's pretty much, and by simply paying lip service to people who have nothing. He's managed to wrench the conservative leadership away from somebody who would, despite us disliking him and despite all his problems, would have at least run it, you know, in a way that wouldn't destroy what we know and love.
Yeah. Now I do think, as much as I make fun of Justin Trudeau for being an imperfect messenger, I actually do think he has a model for someone basically from the same class as him that is, I think, more successful in delivering his political message, and that's Emmanuel Macron. Macron's also obviously very privileged and obviously comes from an extremely educated background, but even though he pursues a much more neoliberal policies than Justin Trudeau, a lot of it is under a background of critiquing the system and saying that he needs to modernize France, and he obviously has a Napoleonic image of himself. But he has a clear mission. He has a clear statement. He's willing to tell the French people who he thinks the good guys and the bad guys are. It's not necessarily 100% compelling, but he is willing to. He at least shows that he's willing to make a problem statement that makes coherent sense. He's willing to show how he personally is the best person to lead in those changes, and he sort of gives himself an energy when he does that. He takes on the fight. He takes on the battles. Like I don't agree with most of the policies that he goes after, but he's always energetic when he goes after them. He's always vigorous. He's always fighting. He's always acting from a place of strength. He's always and he's always going after enemies that he thinks are the most popular enemies, the enemies that are going to make him look good by contrast. Justin Trudeau, for long stretches, will just go missing from the public. He seems to sort of amble from agenda to agenda. He goes after a single policy point, a solid victory, and then he'll just sort of take a break. That's the thing that we're missing. There's no dream, there's no vision, there's no problem statement that he's putting forward. And that's why a guy like Pierre Poilievre represents a challenge to him, because Pierre Poilievre does clearly have a mission. It's defined by freedom. I mean, Justin Trudeau's mission of the working for the middle class and those fighting to join it, it's ringing hollow, and it doesn't mean a whole lot anymore.
It's dead.
Where's the fight that he's fighting?
Exactly.
I think that's what he needs to redefine. Like again, a guy like Emmanuel Macron, I don't agree with his fight at all, but it's clear that he is fighting, and that's what people want. They want a combatant. They want a pugilist. They want someone who's willing to say what is working now. What the system right now is not working, and I recognize it's not working, and I'm going to change it so that it does work. That's a message that Justin Trudeau can adopt if he wants to, but he's choosing not to. It's not a comfortable message for him, because he'd have to be fighting all the time. He'd actually start having to govern rather than just campaigning every few years, which is a lot. It's hard work. I will admit it's hard work, but the difficulty is that's the job he ostensibly signed up for. So it'd be nice if he started showing up for work.
Well, that's the thing with this crew, is they're always surprised to find out that they should have been governing. And it's the easiest place to rag on them, because they're so vulnerable there, and that presents a massive problem. But hey, thank you so much, everybody here for listening and for sticking with us. Really good chat. Not the outcome any of us wanted, but I think we all knew it was coming, and now it's time to get to work and figure out what the heck we do. So with that, for those of you who aren't familiar, we have a podcast called Speech from the Throne. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform, and you can hear us yap once a week. And everybody have a great night. Take care of yourselves, and be well.
And God save the king, since apparently it's mandated we have to say that now after every single stream.
Amazing. All right. Yes. Goodbye. Peace out.
Bye.